So finally, on this section with regards to transitions, we're going to look at default transitions. And I've touched on it previously, but just to nail exactly what I mean by default transitions. This right here is a transition. As we already know, that's a cross dissolve. Now, to apply that quickly, rather than going to effects and finding cross dissolve and dragging it onto here, Control Z to undo, I can quite simply select that end, Shift D. And I know that it's going to add a cross dissolve because we have the blue box around here. There's no blue box around dip to black or additive resolve or even band wipe. But let's say, whatever realm you decided that band wipe was to be your default transition, we can quite simply make that your default transition by right clicking and set selected as default transition. And now no longer do we have a blue box around cross dissolve, we now have a blue box around band wipe. So if we do the same, select the end, Shift D, that now has given us our default transition, which is band wipe. I don't want that. Let's go back to cross dissolve. But there are a couple of other things, or at least one other thing you need to note with regards to defaults, and that is the length of time of that transition. Let's just apply the default transition again and go to the end. Look here, we're in 25 frames. Remember when we set up our sequence? Our sequence setting is 1920 by 1080 or 16:9, and it's 25 FPS, 25 frames a second. This counter is frames, seconds, minutes, and hours. So our default transition is 10 frames. Let's say we wanted to change that. All we have to do is go to Edit, Preferences. I always go straight into General and go to Timeline. In here, it shows you the default durations for your video transition, an audio transition, which we haven't touched on yet, and a still image default duration. Now, the still image default duration is when you drag on any image, or it also includes color mats. Just to prove that, it's defaulted as 12 frames. Let's just go back in and drag in that light gray. And as you can see, we're at 10 frames and we are still with the color mat. If we go to the end of it, 12 frames. So your default image duration includes color mats, any kind of graphics that you drag in here, whether it be vector graphics, whether it be a Photoshop file, because they all work in the Adobe suite, and you can manipulate them in different ways depending on what you're using. But obviously you can then drag this out. Same with the default transition duration. It's set as 10, but you can drag that out. But let's say during your editing process, you feel, I need a longer, you're adding transitions and you think every single time I'm adding a transition, I'm needing more time in that transition. Well, this is where you change it. Edit, Preferences, and you go down to Timeline. You can go Edit, Preferences, and then go straight to Timeline, but I just hit General and then just find it. And we can change it. So you can change it from frames to seconds. And obviously 25 frames, if I went into there, not 245, that'd be a long transition. But say we go from 25 frames, we could then drop it to seconds, and that obviously defaults as 1 second because we're in a 25 frames per second sequence. Similarly, we can change the still duration, let's say to 1 second. I'm pretty sure it used to be 1 second on mine. I've reset my settings since. So let's see how that affects. So let's just leave the playhead where it was. So that's where the end of the default transition used to be. Now if I select the end and Shift D, we're now all the way up to 1 second. So as you can see with this, it's a slower transition in. Not only that, But if we applied it here, we'd now, rather than be 5 frames this way and 5 frames that way, making up the 10 frames, we're now a full second between the transition. For me, a second is too long. But let's just carry on. We were at 12 frames, were we not, for the color mat? By the way, when you're within a sequence on a timeline, right and left on your cursor will go forward and back a frame. Up and down goes to the end of the clips, but that's only if it's selected. Let's bring up another clip here and make it shorter just to show that. If I deselect or toggle off that target, if I press down, it still goes to the end of this clip here. If that was toggled on and I go up, that goes to the end of that clip, and just showing going down, it goes to the end of that clip. That's really, it's an easy one to get wrong, and it's such a great and powerful way to quickly go through your footage if you don't want to scrub. Dialing in exactly what you want your default transition to be and how long you want it to be can really speed up your workflow. Let me show you, for instance. Let's say these are obviously 2 different clips, and let's say we have another 2 different clips, and maybe another, and then maybe another. All of a sudden you've got all these and you think, oh, I'd like to view it back, but I'd like to view it all back with the default transition. That's really quite simple to do in here with your default transition. We hold down Control, remember from the previous section, and draw a marquee. And rather than, if I didn't hold down Control, it would select everything. But if I hold down Control and draw a marquee over, all of a sudden we have engaged and selected just the ends of the clips. If I hit Shift D, it applies a transition to each and every one of those ends. So then, just with literally one click, you've got the default transitions running all the way through this sequence. That's why deciding on and knowing what your default transition is and the duration of that default transition can really help you out. The annoying thing, which is what I really wish Adobe would sort this out. But say I've held down Shift and I've selected a number of transitions, all these cross transitions here. If I pull out one, it only affects that one. That's frustrating. But maybe that'll change in a future bug fix. I don't think it's a bug, but I do think it would be something that I'd love them to add. So yeah, dialing in your default transition duration is really important, and understanding how to apply it can save you a lot of time. Next up, we're on to audio.